Paul is not the only person who've noticed that there's quite a high proportion of Andrews involved in this discussion today. And other people also commented on what extremely enjoyable periods of discussion we've had over the last year and a bit. And I don't know there's any statistical connection between a high proportion of Andrews and a thoroughly successful discussion group, but I suspect there is some. Okay, I'm going to talk about the identification of bubbles and stabilization of the system, as of course it's no point in having a system for stabilizing if it isn't possible to achieve. So the first question is, can we identify bubbles and stabilize the system? I think it's quite clear to everybody what we're trying to do. We simply want to avoid what's just happened. I don't mean we want to avoid the last crisis, because the next crisis may be significantly different in its causes and developments than the last one. But we want to avoid the sort of instabilities which have caused so much pain and are still causing so much pain today. And I will aim to show that we must focus, if we're going to do this, not just on the prices of goods and services, but on the prices of assets, and Sushil has already early indicated some of the reasons for that. Now, I think we've got to a point in which some assumptions which are widely held in the past are seldom heard today, and these, unfortunately, are still occasionally heard today, particularly among those who do not, in my view, have an adult approach to the past mistakes, i.e. it couldn't be our fault, therefore it can't have been the central banks, is one aspect of that which I strongly disagree with. The great moderation, if you like, theory included that it was possible for central banks to maintain low and stable consumer price inflation through changes in interest rates, and that macroeconomic and financial stability would follow from that. It followed, if that was the case, that asset prices should not be a concern of central bankers. Now, there were theories behind these assumptions, and the key one, which Paul has talked about already a bit, was the apparent belief in the efficient market hypothesis. And I'm going to just divert slightly to considering this, because I think it is so central. It is amazing that the efficient market hypothesis has been taken so seriously by so many for so long. The reason why it's amazing is that it's such appalling epistemology. The common cry has been that somehow people's maths have been bad. Bad maths is often attributed as a cause of the problem. I don't think that's the case at all. It's not bad maths, it's a bad understanding of how science works. And the example the efficient market hypothesis gives is excellent. In its original formulation, this hypothesis assumed that there was a random walk with drift to equity market returns and other market returns. And it was quite common to find people writing books like A Random Walk Down Wall Street or something like that. However, this was a testable hypothesis, and it proved to be wrong. It was not robust under testing. Tests showed that markets, in fact, had variance compression, and they had negative serial correlation of return. And there were two choices then. You either scrapped the efficient market hypothesis and put something in its place, and these tests were developed and shown that that was not robust in the early 60s. It's a long time ago. It didn't happen. Nobody produced a new version of the efficient market hypothesis was testable. It therefore fell the wrong side of Karl Popper's famous demarcation between science and non-science. The efficient market hypothesis is, I think, a disgrace, because it is a failure of the whole of the economics profession to be heard if you disagreed with it, or to continue with it if you did agree with it without taking into account the basis that you're trying to establish, which is a testable work, which is scientifically therefore valid. Having diverted, I will now try and move faster onto the other things. The other intellectual error was efficient. It was easy cleanup, that if you had asset prices collapsing, it didn't matter very much. You could deal with the aftermarket very easily. And although these assumptions were disputed by some of us, happily including myself, or I probably wouldn't be here long before the events that took place, they were not fully accepted, and perhaps still aren't, but they were very largely accepted now. And as always in life, it is events rather than arguments which tend to be very convincing. Okay, we've now got an emerging consensus, and it's one which I support. Firstly, that consumer price stability is not enough, but it does remain vital. And we must take steps to mitigate, if we can, the risks of major recessions. Now, it's quite clear that these often follow asset bubbles. People who dispute this seem to me to be very odd. We don't have just the evidence of the problems which came from the asset bubble of 2000 and the asset bubble of 2007 in the US. We've had the 1989 asset bubble in America, where I may point out to you that the collapse of share prices preceded by 2 years any reduction in land prices and was almost instantaneous with the collapse of the economy. Back again to 1929, when it was an equity market bubble, not a housing bubble, which went with the problem. If we are going, therefore, to prevent in future, or at least mitigate the severity, we must address this issue of excess debt and asset bubbles, and we need, therefore, a new policy framework. And that, of course, is what Andrew Large is going to talk about later. Now, there are many ways which we could contribute to this, and I'm not going to deal with them, really. We've got higher equity ratios, escalating the size, which could help reduce the too big to fail problem. Tax reform, which I think is extremely important. I think few things are quite as idiotic as subsidizing debt through the tax system. Legal reform, but mainly here, macroeconomic policy. And given the time, I'm going to concentrate purely on that. Dampening asset bubbles and credit bubbles must be a major concern of macroeconomic management. We need, therefore, to have danger signals which we can recognize. And to do that, we will need to monitor asset prices and debt. Why do asset prices matter? They have a loop with the economy. They make borrowing easier, and they are therefore both the result and the cause of rising debt. But secondly, they are a key transmission process between central bank changes of interest rates and the impact on the real economy. And that transmission mechanism breaks down when we get bubble collapses. Now, the route of asset prices affecting the economy is varied. I can't go through them all. Keynes' comments about the enthusiasms of entrepreneurs being clear and going together, no doubt. But a route that I'm going to show is via savings. And I'm also going to show that this is a transmission mechanism for monetary policy, which it breaks down. Here is an example of the stock market having a direct impact on demand. There is a high correlation between US levels of the stock market and the US levels of pension savings. I may, in parentheses, point out that US pension savings have never been as low in history as they are today. You get, if you call discretionary savings, household savings net of pension savings, you'll find there is also a very strong correlation between discretionary savings and real estate, and the two there are now pretty much in line. Now, I can't go into this one in any great detail, but I did write a book the other day called Wall Street Revalued, The Ineptitude of Central Bankers. And in the appendix of that, James Mitchell did a mathematical demonstration of how interest rates change asset prices, but the impact that they have is ephemeral. It doesn't last. If you induce interest rates, you have a tendency to drive up share prices, but they will revert again to fair value. And the demonstration showed that there's a high probability, right at the top of the chart, in statistical terms, I think nearly 100% probability that within a period of 0 to a year or 3 months to a year, interest rate reductions impact on share prices. But after you've gone there for a length of time, the probability of any impact is nugatory. Another very important aspect, though, is that if you can put in its place, if you can measure asset prices, they have to be testable. And I certainly can't go in the time available on the testability of equity prices. I can assure you, however, that Stephen Wright and I, who developed both this and the tests for it, have shown that both Q and the cyclically adjusted P multiple are testable measures of equity prices. And having found two, we'd automatically found another one, which is if you find two valid measures of something, they must agree. And this chart shows how close the correlation is between these two measures of the equity value of the US stock market. I also show by sight, and I show you it also works mathematically, that these are mean reverting series, which is another key important test. House prices are more tricky. They haven't, I think, on the whole, been a driving force behind crisis, but they may be in the future. Taking data that Bob Schiller's developed from 1900 and the Feinstein data, which goes back, I think, even earlier for the UK, you can see basically that house prices for most times are pretty much flat in real terms. And it was really only in the post-2000 period that we had serious divergence from those long-term trends. Again, very quickly, I'm afraid, I think there is a third asset price which really matters, not only shares and houses, both of which have a direct impact on the savings ratio, but there is also the degree to which the market is prepared to take risk in credit and fixed interest assets. And here the Bank of England has developed, I think, with Lewis Webber and Rohan Sharma, developed a very interesting model which can measure what they call the implied return from illiquidity, which is basically what people expect to be paid, not for taking credit risk or maturity risk, but for simply being prepared to hold one asset which is slightly less liquid than another. And you will see that in the period up to 2000, this was extremely low. People paid very little. It was the heyday, I may say, of LTCM, which was really trying to make money out of the illiquidity price. And then it went up, of course, and then it came right down again, and then woof, it's gone up like a bullet. So I am an obedient person, and I'm looking forward to being the only person so far who's kept within his 15-minute requirement. And I apologize if the result has been that what I've said is a little over-compressed. However, a fuller explanation is available in the book. And I will say that in my conclusions are that we are very lucky because we've got an emerging consensus, which I think is fundamentally correct. Inflation, like patriotism, is not enough. And we must also, therefore, seek to mitigate asset and credit bubbles, which are themselves, of course, connected. And this should be possible because we can observe them. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, would you like to take the podium?
Well, I'd like to add my thanks too to Paul and Richard for having laid on this feast of discussion over the last year. I suppose I've been knocking around for a while, and I have to say I found it one of the most stimulating sets of discussions for many a long year, and it's been a great privilege and excitement actually to be able to pull things apart, step back and try to think through what really matters. I'd secondly like to just thank Alistair Clark, who he and I worked together as colleagues and in various guises, and he made a major contribution to the chapter in the book that you will have seen. Now, the third thing is to thank Andrew Smithers. I'm allowed to thank another Andrew, I think, because he's paved the way for what I have to say. And of course, being in the after-lunch slot is always tough, but maybe it helps if you have a slightly different angle. So you may hear a slightly different emphasis in this area than you heard from Sushil and Howard before lunch. So if I could just move on. What I'd like to do is to start by making 4 propositions that are all for debate. I have to say this whole area is for debate and for lively discussion, because there really are no blacks and whites in the area. And just to avoid confusion and make it quite clear, I'm not going to be talking about supervision as such. I'm certainly not going to be talking about architecture or how different aspects of regulation should fit together with or without central banks. The first proposition I'd like to make is that there has been a very significant policy gap. There was a historic presumption, I think, that central banks sort of dealt with systemic issues. But over the last 20 years, that assumption got put on one side, partly, I may say, because other areas of policy were accorded fairly definitive frameworks within which to operate, whereas in the case of systemic and macroprudential issues, these were not articulated. They were left unclear. They were put in the too difficult box. And it's when I was at the Bank of England, it was all too apparent that this was actually the case at that time. It just is a tragedy that we had to have a good crisis before the matter is now being looked at carefully. The second proposition I would make is that regulation won't do it. Yes, there are all this plethora of initiatives with which many of us are familiar. There's debate about many of them as to how effective they're going to be, but there isn't a nerve center of authority that really focuses on the systemic aspects of all of these micro initiatives, and there is no joining up process as to what they all mean and how effective collectively they may prove to be. Third proposition is that, of course, yes, it's a global issue, and you can worry about leakage, you can worry about arbitrage. These are real issues. But you have to start somewhere if you're going to deliver in this area, and you have to start where the fiscal authority resides and where the legal framework is such that measures can be taken that are regarded as legitimate. I'll come back to where the global dimension fits in just towards the end of my remarks, but this is effectively about how national jurisdictions can handle these issues. And the last proposition is that whether jurisdictions did or did not suffer in this last crisis, clearly the UK did, the US did, much of Europe did, Australia, Canada, China, Malaysia didn't. Nonetheless, the issues remain the same for everybody, and what is today's problem within one jurisdiction could well turn into tomorrow's problem in another, and therefore I think the lessons can be learned both from those who failed and from those who succeeded. Well, Adair this morning devoted quite a bit of time to the question of what gives rise to this, and I'm not going to go back over that ground, but I am just going to emphasize one aspect of the root cause of systemic problems and of crises. And that, quite simply, is that they arise when leverage in the broad sense, borrowing and debt, get to an area where a perhaps random spark can cause confidence in the system to collapse and bring about the cycle which gives rise to crises that we are familiar with. And of course there are also many indicators of this. Andrew has very aptly drawn attention to them in terms of asset prices, credit spreads, maturity mismatches where people's risk appetites have been compromised, and in many other fields as well. So if the root cause can be thought of as lying with leverage being too high, you then can perhaps think about, well, who creates that leverage? How is it created? Because if you are able to draw some conclusions about that, then you can perhaps draw some conclusions about what you might try to do about it. We're all familiar with the major creators of leverage, the banking system generally, whether banks or quasi-banks, I'm not going to get to the definition. The insurance world, to a more limited extent, but the insurance world provides guarantees to banks, which are effectively, therefore, contributing to the build-up of leverage. And, of course, as we've heard in other presentations, embedded leverage within products of one sort or another. There are, of course, the users of that credit. And, but I think that the issue that seems to me to be very important is that if we're going to act in relation to the root cause, then we have to act in relation to the creators of credit. You've got to do something about the supply. Of course, you can put restrictions on users too, and that may be important in certain angles. But it's above all, it's the tap that needs to be fixed. Well, if those points are on the table, the question then is, you need to have a framework to do something about it. How are you actually going to deliver a response to your analysis? And I've listed here 6 different issues that seem to me to be very important when thinking about the framework that you need. And I will just talk briefly on each one of these. The first is the question of mandate and objectives. It does seem to me to be important, as with all policy areas, that there is clarity of mandate and clarity of objective as to what it is we're seeking to do. This, of course, has been sadly one of the things that's been so sadly neglected. It's been neglected in law and it's been neglected in practice. And if the objective would be to secure and maintain financial stability, then it seems to me there are a number of different aspects that need to be covered in the mandate. Clearly, you have to be able to review and assess the ongoing systemic situation. How close are you to the danger point, in other words? You've got to be able to identify threats that may be on the horizon that could come as sparks to cause a conflagration. You've absolutely got to be able to come up with a policy response, and that needs policy instruments on the one hand and an ability to deliver them on the other. The second thing you need, apart from the mandate, is authority. There has to be overarching oversight, and that in itself is not to be taken for granted, because to oversee something you absolutely require information in order to be able to achieve it. And then you have to have authority in relation to your policy response. This, of course, gets into very tricky territory, which many have pointed out, including in our conversations today, as to where you would draw the line, as to what authority you would give to the body that would be tasked with the delivery of policy. Because you could argue that since many areas of policy have a systemic overlay, I mean, obviously all the regulatory areas, consumer protection areas too, as we found in the United States, the fiscal policy, competition policy, all of them have a systemic overlay. Where do you actually draw the line as to what would be the task and mandate of the parties responsible? The question of data and indicators is important. There's a long list here, really just to indicate that this is a hugely complicated and difficult task. There are a very large number of different areas of information that are going to be of value to those who are thinking about what to do to handle systemic problems. And not only is there a very wide reach of them, but there are also multiple sources from which that data is going to need to come. You have macro sources, which of course those involved in monetary policy are quite familiar with. You have micro sources. You're going to need a lot of information from supervisory authorities, etc. And you need market intelligence. You absolutely need to have a feel for actually what's going on in people's minds as to what they're really thinking about the cushion that they see between where things are and where disaster might occur. And above all, this data, which is so huge and wide in expanse, is going to have to be relevant. And the big trick that will arise is in boiling down the data such that that which is used for assessment purposes is indeed relevant. And I should have perhaps added here that very importantly, in this question of assessment, will come transparency of the assessment process. In other words, it will be very important that people understand, not just the policymakers, but the public, the politicians and others, need to understand what lies behind the assessment that is being made in relation to the mandate. So then the question comes, well, if you're going to have an area of policy which people may well not like, because it would be bound to want to take action just when people were indeed enjoying the party, and that of course upsets politicians because their growth story gets interfered with. It upsets the intermediaries because their profits get interfered with, and perhaps their bonuses too. And it also upsets the users of credit because they also often enjoy parties. So in order for this to work, there will need to be both legitimacy with a small l, I'm assuming there would be legitimacy with a big L, but legitimacy generally and respect accorded to it. You'll find also that what this also says is that this is going to require, in order to get this legitimacy and respect, significant input from central bankers, regulators, practitioners, and academics. You've got a wide range of parties involved. Then the question comes of what sort of vehicle do you need? Here, of course, there's room for a lot of debate, and it will vary, I'm sure, from country to country. There are those, I think I probably amongst them, who would favour having a dedicated committee process, adequately resourced, that would be able and tasked to make these assessments. There are others who might prefer that it would be carried out by an existing body or perhaps even a new body, though I think that if the creation of new bodies is something you want to be very careful about in terms of their effectiveness. But I think above all, the takeaway that's important here is that it is important, it seems to me, that this capability would be anchored at the central bank. I'm not saying it should be the central bank any more than technically the Monetary Policy Committee is the central bank. But it should be anchored there and resourced there for a whole variety of reasons that I've outlined in the slide and won't repeat. I think you're probably familiar with them. The question of instruments comes up. Now, I haven't got time to go into this in detail, but the debate here is very, very difficult. There are many, many instruments that could be used that would have an impact on the systemic situation. And the question is, should there be a single instrument which is, so to speak, owned by the policymakers that they would have the direct authority to deploy? And then if that is the case, what about all the other instruments that could come into play? Should these policymakers be in a position to require other policymakers to do things for systemic reasons that they might not have done within their existing mandates? This is very tricky stuff with governance issues, accountability issues, etc., which we can debate. And you can think perhaps of a sort of spectrum of where different policy instruments actually lie. My own candidate for what might be the owned policy instrument of this body or committee, whatever it might be, is the capital ratios. The reason for that is that this seems to me to get closest to the question of the root cause. In other words, it really gets at the supply of leverage, of credit and leverage into the economy. Interest rates, of course, can also be very important, but they work on both sides of the balance sheet as opposed to directly getting to the cost of intermediation, and therefore that would at any rate be my preferred approach, but there may well be other views as far as that's concerned. And there are all kinds of tricky issues as far as calibration is concerned. You know, if you're going to use an instrument, what impact is a given move in that instrument going to have? We had these problems earlier with monetary policy, and we've learnt a lot over the years since we've had a formalized monetary policy system. We're going to need to learn a lot, it seems to me, as well, in this systemic area as well. So there are clearly a number of very tough issues to debate. Feasibility of doing it, I'm persuaded yes. As Mervyn King mentioned the other day, it's all untested and untried, but that doesn't mean to say it shouldn't be tested and tried. The question of legitimacy, I think that we know enough about how you can create legitimacy for an area of policy. And as to cost and growth, which has been raised earlier in our conversations, all I could say is that the cost of busts is incredibly high. So it seems to me there's quite a bit of headroom, even if growth during what would be an upturn, perhaps a more modest upturn, would be slightly lower, then you could avoid the falling off the precipice, which is what we've had to endure as a result of the crisis. The whole relationship with monetary policy is a very tricky one. My own thoughts are that there are different drivers for systemic policy than there are for price stability, and that if you try and push the two together, actually you could end up with suboptimality on both sides. I can absolutely see that there could be a time when we really know enough about it that you could bring them all together. But it's not just the policymakers who don't know how to do all of this until they've tried, and nor does the public understand it, nor do the politicians understand it. And it seems to me to be important that we have a real focus on an area of policy which badly needs to be understood, particularly, as I said, because it won't always be very popular. There are two, the other issue which I just revert to lastly is the question of where this fits in a global world. We must remind ourselves that it is only at the national level that there is a fiscal support, which is of course vital to have in the background of any systemic policy, and where the voters reside. So what does that leave or what does that suggest as far as the global dimension is concerned? I think it helps to perhaps think of three areas that can be developed. Let the minister in. Good afternoon, Minister. There are three areas that can be developed and I think are important. The first one is that the global community could actually assist to put pressure on individual jurisdictions to create frameworks of this nature. If these are not fairly generally put into place, then of course the argument of leakage and arbitrage gets all the stronger. But if they are, then that can itself help to strengthen the entire framework. The second is that, of course, at the global side, in the global sense, standards in relation to the various micro policy areas and instruments is obviously important. It's important that that the outputs that these are seeking to achieve are widely understood and are calibrated in similar manner. And thirdly, of course, there's the whole question of data flow and coordination of policy. If different countries are at different places and taking somewhat different views, it's clearly very important that there should be some form of either bilateral or clearinghouse in order to accommodate that. I couldn't resist putting this by way of example for the UK because it's in the paper that I wrote. The particular issues, we've covered many of them, but I don't intend to go over them in detail here. You could debate all of them, of course. But what you will notice in this approach is that it has or does borrow quite a lot from what I think overall has been quite a successful approach to monetary policy, which I see as sitting alongside the framework that would be put into place. So in conclusion, and I'm sorry, Andrew, I did overshoot a few minutes, it may be tough. It may be that a framework of this sort would develop, would produce unwelcome medicine, but I really do think that we owe it not just to ourselves, but to future generations to try it, because I think, as many people have suggested, the next crisis could be a lot worse. Thank you.